This week on Jerusalem Dateline, Russian fighter jets strike cities where U.S.-backed rebels are fighting Assad instead of hitting ISIS. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu gives the UN 45 silent seconds to think about their silence regarding Iran's threat to annihilate Israel. And the fourth blood moon is seen over Israel as Jews and Christians celebrate the Feast of Sukkot. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Julie Stahl, filling in for Chris Mitchell. The Russian military has descended on Syria, saying Russia just wants to help Syria in its fight against Islamic terrorists. And although President Obama has welcomed their involvement, some lawmakers in the United States believe Moscow has ulterior motives. Gary Lane has that story.
Russian fighter jets strike deep into the heart of Syria. But instead of hitting ISIS, the Russian bombers destroyed targets in Homs and Hama, cities where only U.S.-backed rebels are fighting against the Assad regime. This amateur video shows the mayhem and carnage left behind by the Russians. The Russians provided only an hour advance warning of the airstrikes. That potentially endangered American pilots already in Syrian airspace. President Obama and Secretary of State John Kerry say they welcome Russian efforts to defeat ISIS. But while the Russians insisted they hit 20 Islamic State targets, including a command center, U.S. Defense Secretary Ash Carter questioned their motives.
It does appear that they were in areas where there probably were not ISIL forces, and that is precisely one of the problems with this whole approach.
So it now appears Russia has entered Syria only to help prop up Bashar al-Assad's dwindling regime. Some members of the president's own party are questioning the decision that gave Russia that green light to join the fight.
The problem with Russia is we do not trust their motives. They are propping up Assad, who is a barbaric and tyrant leader of Syria.
Some of the worst criticism came from Republican Senator John McCain, who said Russia has gained a foothold in Syria because of President Obama's retreat from the Middle East. McCain said there has been, quote, a series of decisions or non-decisions, which has led to the situation we see today, where Vladimir Putin may have inserted Russia into the Middle East in a way that Russia has not enjoyed since 1973, when the Russians were thrown out of Egypt. Several years ago, President Obama drew a red line against Bashar al-Assad's use of chemical weapons against his own people. Today, many Americans are likely wondering if the president has the will to draw another red line in Syria, this time against the Russians. Gary Lane, CBN News.
Russia's presence in Syria may unleash greater turmoil in the Middle East. Our Middle East Bureau Chief Chris Mitchell spoke with CBN News' George Thomas and Gary Lane about what all this means for the Jewish state.
Let me begin with you, Gary.
Yes.
Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, claims that he is doing this in order to go after terrorists, and has also said he wants to stabilize and protect Assad. What is the United States saying?
Well, of course, what Putin is saying, he's trying to make us believe that what he really wants is he wants us to believe that he's going after ISIS, but there's some indication, George, that he actually hit non-ISIS groups, rebel groups that are fighting Assad. What he really wants is to keep Assad in power, or at least the family in power.
Yeah. As Gary mentioned, in fact, the Associated Press is actually reporting that a moderate Western-backed Syrian rebel group says one of its leading officers has been killed in the Russian airstrikes happening in Homs. As you know, Chris, ISIS is not in Homs. Why is Russia going after Homs? Why is it going after rebels that the CIA has been training and funding?
Well, I think, George, they're actually going to preserve the Assad regime. And I think there's two enemies they have. Certainly the forces that are against Assad. They want to preserve his regime. They want to preserve their holdings already in Syria. They have that port in Tartus and that Latakia in that region. They want to expand their influence. They do want to go after ISIS, but the war against ISIS is just a pretext in order to help them fight and protect Assad's regime.
Okay, this is all about Bashar al-Assad.
Yes.
You know this very well. Russia has had a long-term time relationship with Assad.
Why? With Assad's father, long before him.
Exactly. Hafez Assad, al-Assad. Why do the Russians want to protect Assad?
Well, because Assad's a friend of theirs, and also he's close to the Shiites. So it's not just helping Assad, it's coming against the Sunnis who have been fighting against Russia, but also it's power and influence, George. Russia wants to have influence in the Middle East.
Chris, this is the first time, to you, Chris, this is the first time that Russia has launched a military strike in the heart of the Middle East since the 1980s. Let me paint this picture for you. Iraq's prime minister has just come out saying that cooperation with Russia, Syria, and Iran is only for intelligence purposes. There is no military coordination between Russia, Syria, Iraq, and Syria. The fact that you have the Iranians in there, along with the Iraqis, coordinating with Russia, is this good?
Oh, I think it's very bad for the whole region, George. You know, just a few days ago, I think there was a relationship and alliance between Iran, Hezbollah, Russia, and Syria. And they said at the time, this is one of the biggest alliances in years, if not decades. The Middle East is shifting under our feet as we speak. And I have to say that I think you'd agree that this is because of a vacuum left by the United States of America. They had the opportunity to go in there years ago and do what they could against either the Assad regime when the Syrian civil war started, or against ISIS in the last year or so. But they've been timid and they haven't had to use the power that they could have. And the allies in the region, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Jordanians, and the Egyptians, they all are terrified, I think, at what's happening right now by the lack of the U.S. leadership.
Chris Mitchell in Jerusalem, sir, thank you so much for your insights. Glad that you are back safe. And Gary Lane, thank you again and welcome back home.
Thank you.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu told the United Nations they should check their enthusiasm over the Iranian nuclear deal at the door.
This deal doesn't make peace more likely. By fueling Iran's aggressions with billions of dollars in sanctions relief, it makes war more likely.
Netanyahu has urged the international community to rein in Iran for years, but without success. He also chided the world body for remaining silent while Iran threatens Israel's destruction. For effect, he stood silently for 45 seconds during his address. Netanyahu also said he is prepared to resume peace talks with the Palestinians immediately. Shortly after his speech, Palestinian terrorists murdered an Israeli mother and father in a drive-by shooting on their car. Their 4 sons, aged 4 months to 9 years, witnessed the killing from the back seat. Netanyahu blamed Palestinian incitement against Israel over the Temple Mount for the terror attack. The attack came just 1 day after Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas told world leaders at the UN he no longer has to abide by the agreements that paved the road for a two-state solution with Israel. Abbas's statements came as the Palestinians were allowed to raise their flag at the United Nations headquarters for the first time. Abbas promised the Palestinian flag would soon be raised in Jerusalem, referring to Israel's capital as, quote, the capital of our Palestinian state. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu issued a statement calling on Abbas to act responsibly and answer his proposal for direct negotiations with Israel without any preconditions. Netanyahu said, "The fact that time after time he does not respond is the best proof that he has no intention of reaching a peace agreement." Up next, the fourth blood moon is seen over Israel. Welcome back to Jerusalem Dateline. For the past 2 years, millions around the world have been fascinated by blood moons from 4 lunar eclipses in a row, called a tetrad. As Chris Mitchell reports from Jerusalem, many see them as a sign God himself has placed in the heavens.
During a lunar eclipse, the moon turns the color of blood. It's extremely rare to have 4 in a row fall during the feast commanded by the Lord in the Bible. Of the 4 blood moons, this is the first one visible from Israel. But like all of the eclipses in this tetrad, it falls on the first day of a biblical feast, this time the Feast of Tabernacles. Many who came to witness the blood moon believe it's a sign of harvest.
We really sense that the Holy Spirit is coming with a massive harvest, great awakening, and I believe this is the red moon is a harvest moon, that it's an indicator of a jubilee of jubilees for the souls of man.
Previous tetrads of blood moons, all falling on Jewish feast days, have coincided with major events for Israel and the Jewish people. In 1492, the Jews were expelled from Spain and Columbus discovered America, which would become a safe haven for the Jewish people. In 1948, Israel was reborn as a nation, and in 1967, Israel recaptured Jerusalem during the Six-Day War. Bob Odell wrote a book about the blood moons. He believes they're a sign of good things ahead for Israel, but perhaps troubling times for nations that come against her.
I personally believe that in the years ahead, we will begin to look at Israel in a new way. That these blood moons mark a new phase in the life of Israel. It's no longer about the Israel that is struggling to survive, but now it is about an Israel that is learning to thrive.
Odell says it will be more than 500 years before 4 blood moons fall again on the first days of the Feast of Passover and Tabernacles. Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
The Shemitah year in Israel has also drawn a lot of interest from Christians around the world. Some have linked the biblical agricultural practice to dramatic world events throughout history. Israelis marked the official end of that year this week by following a unique biblical command. Take a look at what we saw at Jerusalem's Western Wall. It happens once in 7 years. Tens of thousands of Israelis gather at the Western Wall at Sukkot to listen as rabbis and political leaders read and sing the Word of God to them. The reading signals the official end of the Shemitah year, when Jewish people let their farmland lie fallow. Deuteronomy 31 says, "At the end of every 7 years, at the Feast of Tabernacles, you shall read this law before all Israel, and the stranger who is within your gates, that they may hear and that they may learn to fear the Lord your God and carefully observe all the words of this law." This year, Israeli President Reuven Rivlin read from Psalms 122.
Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. May they prosper who love you. Peace be within your walls, prosperity within your palaces.
The crowd listened and prayed and recited scriptures after the rabbi. Earlier in the day, thousands of Jews from Israel and around the world also gathered at the Western Wall to celebrate another biblical tradition that takes place 3 times a year. It's called the Birkat HaKohanim, or the priestly blessing. God commanded Aaron to bless the Jewish people, saying, "The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace." CBN News asked some participants why they came.
It's a very special thing to be able to get a blessing from so many Kohanim, and the blessing really comes from God, and it goes through the Kohanim to the people. So we wanted to see if we could be part of it.
It's very important because these people who are blessing us, they're holy people, and they're bringing the blessings down from God to us.
And I just had this awakening and arousing, and I felt very inspired to be here with thousands and thousands of Jewish people on this holy day.
And even at the end of a long, hot day, there was enough energy left for rejoicing. Up next, who will write our history? A new documentary by Nancy Spielberg. Documentary filmmaker Nancy Spielberg joined us this week to talk about her new film, Who Will Write Our History? The film is about a hidden archive stashed in the Warsaw Ghetto before the Jews there were killed. Here's Chris Mitchell in Jerusalem with Nancy Spielberg.
Nancy, great to be with you, and thanks for joining us on Jerusalem Dateline.
Love it here.
You did a documentary called Above and Beyond about airmen that helped Israel during the War of Independence. Why do you think it struck such a chord among many people?
You know, I think that, first of all, it was a big surprise story. You know, even people who knew a lot about the history of Israel or about, you know, the American history didn't know this piece. And I think that was the number one of the wow. And it was also like, why would these World War II vets, they had, you know, finished their tour of duty for the United States, they survived World War II, what possessed them to pick up and go and fight again in another person's war? And I think that's, you know, question perplexed people, and I think that's probably why it grabbed their attention.
And what did possess them?
You know, they saw the survivors coming out of the camps, coming into Israel, which was newly established as a state, and walking into a potential genocide. Israel was attacked on all fronts in 1948 by all the surrounding countries. And I think they felt this was part of their duty from World War II to secure not just the release from the camps, but their you know, tour, their trip home.
And you've showed it here in Israel to members of the IDF. What kind of reaction have you had?
Well, I was really nervous about the Israeli audience because, you know, I am telling their history, but they're really not the stars of this film. It's really, you know, this documentary is really about the Americans. But they were so emotional and very, very grateful. So I think it went over very well. And the commander of the Air Force here in Israel actually would like it to be a part of all the pilots' training courses, that they should know their roots. Yeah.
Speaking of history, you're preparing another documentary about who will write our history. Tell us about that.
Again, Roberta Grossman, who's the director of Above and Beyond, had found this book, Who Will Write Our History, and had bought the movie rights 7 years ago. And that, actually, I pulled her away to do Above and Beyond, and the whole time we were filming, she said, but I'm doing that, you've got to hear about this other story, you know, about a group of people that saw the writing on the wall. They knew they would not survive, most likely, the Warsaw Ghetto. And they said, if we do not collect and write our histories, our history will be written by the Germans and we will no longer exist. And they gathered up diaries and they wrote journals and they had children write essays and they had poems and recipes and every aspect of life and death in the Warsaw Ghetto. And then they wrote their last will and testimonies and they buried these in milk cans and tin boxes, literally as the Germans were pounding on the door. And after the war, only 3 people from this secret group survived, and they went back through the rubble and tried to find where was the cellar under all of the rubble. They found 2, one is still buried, and unearthed these documents. And it's incredible because it's like finding 50 Anne Frank diaries, and the world knows Anne Frank, and if the world knew anything of the Holocaust before Schindler's List, it was probably from the diary of Anne Frank.
And there's one other project you're working on. Many people know about Miracle on Ice, but this is the Miracle on Hardwood.
Right.
About the Israeli team playing the Soviet Union.
1977. It's such a great story because it's just Israel.
It is. It's just
That wasn't a camel, but you know, that was cute. It's very cute.
Yeah.
In 1977, Maccabi Tel Aviv basketball team, which was not known to be a great team, took on some American players, Tal Brody, Ossie Perry, and they were getting better and better, and they entered into the World Games, and before you know it, they were up against the Russians, and that was the top team, you know, to beat. And Israel knew that it did not have a shot, but Israel was a very downtrodden country at that point. They were still very, very demoralized from the Yom Kippur War in 1973, and they sort of needed a good boost. And it turned out that they actually won a game against the Soviet Army's team, and when they won, the entire country here, you know, the streets were quiet, everybody watched the game, and Tal Brody, the captain of the team, when they won, he said, "Anachnu ala mapa," we are on the map. Israel's on the map, not just in basketball, but everything.
Yeah.
And it's just such a great sports story. It's a David and Goliath story.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. It's a David and Goliath story. At this time in history and Israel's history, how important do you think it is that Israel gets support from Christians around the world?
This is the time that we need all of Israel's friends banded together, because the other forces that are out there are so strong, and they're not just anti-Israel, anti-Jewish. Many of them are anti-American. So I think we fool ourselves when we say this is just, you know, we have a lot of problems going on with ISIS, with Hezbollah, with Hamas, with all of these factions that want to just take us out. And I think that we need to bond together. I think people that believe in God and have a faith and know, you know, believe in treating each other the right way are those that stay together to build a better world.
Well, Kol hakavod, well done.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nancy, for being with us.
I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you, Chris. Thanks.
Coming up, dress rehearsal for the Book of Zechariah. Welcome back. As Israel faces pressure from all sides, it needs more support from its friends than ever. That help is coming from evangelical Christians around the world. Here's what we heard when we visited the Christian Embassy's Feast of Tabernacles celebration this year in Jerusalem. Some 5,000 international Christians from more than 80 nations visited Jerusalem this week. They came to celebrate the biblical feast of Sukkot. Israeli President Reuven Rivlin and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu welcomed them at the International Christian Embassy's Feast of Tabernacles event.
Dear friend, thank you for coming up from year to year to worship the King, the God of hosts. Thank you for standing with us.
And the fact is, Israel has no better friends around the world. You give us support at all times, and especially in times of distress.
ICEJ Director Jürgen Buehler believes as the number of evangelical Christians increases, so does the potential to make political changes in Israel's favor.
They read the Bible about Israel, they love Israel, they want to pray for Israel, they support Israel, they talk to their government leaders about Israel, and we saw over the last years even that some of those African nations, they changed legislations which were intended against Israel. They say, we don't want this to take place in our country.
Mayan Jaffe is a reporter for the Jewish News Service.
There are growing numbers of Christians in countries where they will impact the parliament, impact voting in the United Nations. And, you know, the best thing that we can do for ourselves politically is to take advantage of those opportunities and not focus on what we have different from one another, but focus on what we have in common.
The ICEJ's feast is Israel's largest annual tourist event. They call it a kind of dress rehearsal based on Zechariah 14, when the Bible says all nations will one day come to Jerusalem to worship the King. Psalms 122 says, "Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. They shall prosper who love you." That's all for this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Thanks for joining us. Remember, you can follow us throughout the week on Facebook, Twitter, and now Periscope. I'm Julie Stahl, filling in for Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.